from my book manuscript that has been, submitted to the publisher recently on, debating immigrants and refugees in Central Europe. So I'll just try to very briefly walk you through some of the, research aims and, general methodological issues to give you some kind of a backdrop for the interpretation of the results that I will discuss eventually. And I very much basically depart from the idea that Central Europe has not really been a focus of migration research, well, or at least comparatively much less than the immigration states or Western European countries, the US, Australia, and many other countries. And this has been, quite logical. This is quite logical because immigration for a long time was not really a salient socio-political issue in the region, and especially I can speak about, Czech Republic, politically, but also for the other countries as well. So that was quite logical that, there's not been that much research on the framing or the politicization and the politics of immigration in general. In these countries, in the Central Eastern European countries. But this has really changed in 2015, as the refugee crisis, put immigration very high on the agenda. And this was basically the kind of backdrop for my research, or this is where I actually started. And then I decided, well, let's do some research on the politics of immigration in the region. And I asked a question about especially two issues: the politicization and framing of immigration, or immigrants especially, in my book manuscript. It's mostly about framing of immigrants or exclusively about framing of immigrants and refugees rather than about immigration policy or integration policy per se. And really the question was about, analyzing two aspects of it. Its politicization and the various types of framing that were present in the debates surrounding immigrants and refugees. And just very shortly, about politicization, I mostly in the book investigate against two main dimensions, that is alliance and so relative and absolute alliance, and the next actor expansion that I will not really talk about today because of the limited space. Obviously, there's a lot in the book that I will not be able to cover, and I decided not to cover this actor expansion. But this is mostly about who are the people, especially in the news media, appearing, speaking about immigrants and refugees. When it comes to framing, I basically decided to select several what I call, immigration-specific master frames, and look on the, presence or absence of those in both the news media and political arena. I will get to that just in a while. So that was the first kind of descriptive question. I will get to, outline the immigration-specific master frames just in a while. And I also asked the question: how does framing vary? How does it vary based on how immigrants and refugees are categorized? And again, I will discuss the types of categorization just in a while. But these were basically the two main questions regarding framing. Then there was a third question to which I will also get in a while. The idea to select what I call the immigration-specific master frame, just few of those, eventually 5, was that I do not cover too few frames, and at the same time, I do not investigate the presence of too many frames. So, the frames to be analyzed eventually, or whose presence is analyzed eventually, should not be too general or too specific at the same time. And the idea really was to end up with a meaningful number of relevant frames whose prominence or salience will be analyzed in the data set. And very often there is a certain backdrop, because if you look into the literature, it identifies really a huge number of different frames that are related either to immigrants and refugees or to immigration policy per se. Some of those can very easily be subsumed into, more general frames. So this is the case for instance, with the religious frame, which very often you can very easily subsume within the wider cultural and identity frame, as religion is very often understood part of culture. On the other hand, you have certain frames in the literature that are, I would say, too general, such as the intruder frame, because the intruder frame, as it is often understood in the literature, is basically means immigrants and refugees posing security, cultural, or economic threat. So eventually, at the end of the day, this is very general, because you don't really know how do we speak about immigrants when we speak or when we use the intruder frame. So against this backdrop, I really selected, combination of deductive and inductive approach, but I really selected 5, what I really call master frames. And this is the security, cultural, economic, humanitarian, and, what I call administrative framing. So these are the 5 master frames whose presence I'm, eventually investigating in both political and media arena. I guess that most of those are, obvious. Clearly, these 5, this is not the only option. And as I said, this was my selection based on inductive and deductive identification, and also ensuring that we have, and I have certain pragmatic, eventually, a pragmatic amount of frames to be analyzed. Most of those, I guess, security, cultural, economic, and humanitarian are pretty self-explanatory. What is perhaps not always that clear is administrative framing. And administrative framing really understands immigrants and refugees as a governance, challenge usually. So in terms of administrative policy, governance, or managerialist terms. So that's basically the substance of the administrative framing. You can understand it as return policy. Speaking of issues regarding to capacities of asylum centers or refugee centers or whatever they are. So really in those policy making, governance, and administrative terms, this is the meaning of the frame. Now, what do I analyze very quickly? 2 countries, Czechia and Slovakia, whose languages I understand, obviously. And the period is a period surrounding the 2015-2016 refugee crisis, so covering October to October 2013, 2017. So basically 4 years period. And I identified the relevant immigrant-related speeches and news items using the keyword search. This is not really that important right now. What's perhaps more important is that in the news media, I cover all main newspapers and main evening television newscasts in the 2 countries. Overall, I identified almost 9,000 immigrant-related news items. In the political arena, I basically cover all plenary speeches by politicians, so excluding civil servants appearing, from now and then on the floor. And this is basically almost 60,000 speeches in the 2 countries during the investigated period. And there were, 1,600 more and more, almost 1,700 immigrant-related speeches identified within the time period. So this is basically the basis of the research that I will present eventually. The presence or absence of frames is identified using manual quantitative content analysis. So I obviously had a lot of research assistants helping me with that. Without them, this would not really be possible. Frames were identified based on predefined framing and reasoning devices. So there's been a long list of framing and reasoning devices for each frame, and based on their presence in individual speeches or news items, individual frames were either identified or present as absent. And eventually, each frame was also coded for its valence or tone, either as negative or positive. And this tone was based on coding, immigrants and refugees being either a threat or contribution to the host society. So ranging from -1 to 1, but this is a technicality, I believe now. Lastly, and that's perhaps, what I found most interesting eventually about my research, I differentiate three categories of immigrants. And these categories really have to be explicitly mentioned in the speeches or in the news items. And the first is legal status category, distinguishing between asylum seekers, irregular immigrants, and labor migrants. The second one is religious category, basically distinguishing between immigrants with Muslim religious background and any other religious backgrounds. And then region of origin category, distinguishing between immigrants and refugees either coming from the Middle East and North Africa, non-EU Eastern Europe, because that's relevant in the region here, and also Southeast Asia, because these countries, most of them have significant Vietnamese minorities as well. So these are basically the three regions of origin that I distinguish. And then the last research objective that I will have in my book is to try to account for framing and politicization. So I also eventually, beyond the descriptive analysis, get to conduct certain explanatory accounts or explanatory analysis of politicization and framing, mostly based on regression model, regression analysis. Anyway, now to the results, which is the more important part, and I also hope more interesting one. If you look into the media and political arena, what you will see regarding salience of immigrants and refugees, well, very similar results in the first place. I will show you the media arena first. But what you will see is very similar results in terms of immigrants and refugees being mostly invisible in the discourse, in the media and political arena before 2015 in the two countries. However, then, as the crisis broke out in, the second quarter of 2015, what you will see is a huge spike of the, salience of immigrants and refugees in both the media, and you can look here at the political arena. So basically, what you can in a nutshell, what you can say is that immigration or immigrants and refugees were pretty invisible before 2015. Then they were very salient in 2015 and 2016. But again, then the salience decreased in 2017, and very often even to almost pre-crisis levels that I have recorded in 2013 and 2014. So you basically have this, spike in the 2 years, 2015 and 2016, and then a decrease in 2017 again. Now, regarding some accounting for the salience of immigrants and refugees, you can very easily see, or my results very easily show, that humanitarian incidents are followed the next 30 days. Following humanitarian incidents in Europe are followed by very important and very substantively large spikes in the salience of immigrants and refugees in both the media as well as the political arena. Interestingly, I do not find any association between terrorist attacks occurring and salience of immigrant-related items in the next 30 days, which is something that, was a surprise for me, because I expected there's going to be an association between these two. Interestingly, the politicization or salience of immigrants and refugees is also not linked to national level migration and asylum statistics. So illegal border crossings recorded in Czechia or Slovakia, or the number of asylum applications recorded in Czechia and Slovakia is not linked at any lags, is not really linked to the politicization of refugees and immigrants in the two arenas. Based on the regression analysis, my results really show that the year 2017 was almost really getting to the pre-crisis levels when it comes to salience of immigrants and refugees. So basically, it's like 2015 and 2016 is surrounded by years where there is quite low salience of immigrants and refugees. And I also used various techniques to control for the for the crisis effect, and clearly it is. There is a huge crisis effect. So, for instance, in the media, on average, during the crisis between June 2015 and March 2016, you have about 50 more news items dealing with refugees and immigrants compared to the non-crisis months or non-crisis period. Finally, what is interesting that the salience of immigrants and refugees very much follows EU-wide immigration statistics or is associated with those. So a number of EU28 asylum applications, as well as data on EU-wide illegal border crossings, are linked with an increase of the salience of immigrants and refugees in the two countries in their media and political arena. And I can now get to discuss the framing. I'll start with the media arena. And what you can see, it's better if I show you the graph and cover it. What you can see that you basically have three groupings of frames in terms of their salience. The security and cultural frame were clearly the most visible, the most salient in the media arena. Then you have the economic and administrative frame being, significantly less visible, but still significantly more visible than the last frame, the humanitarian frame. So this is basically for the media arena. When you go to the political arena, the plenary speeches, you will see similar yet different pattern, because here the administrative and security frames will be the most salient, followed by the economic and cultural, and then the least significantly, the least salient humanitarian frame in the two countries, plenary debates, which tells you basically that in both arenas, the humanitarian frame or humanitarian framing is the least visible of all the types of framing. On the other hand, security framing is highly predominant in both the media and the political arena in the two countries. In other words, immigrants and refugees were highly securitized. At the same time, it's perhaps not so surprising that administrative framing is very visible in the political arena, because this is where policies are debated and eventually adopted. So it's quite logical that policy-making frame is very visible there. Now, like with politicization, framing seems to follow real-world developments, and here the presence of those individual frames is to a large extent related to either terrorist attacks and humanitarian incidents occurring or in Europe. So just in a nutshell, humanitarian incidents, they decrease the likelihood of cultural framing in the next 30 days. They, at the same time, highly increase humanitarian framing in the next 30 days after they occur, which is basically not really so surprising that you have more humanitarian framing after humanitarian incidents, for instance, shipwreck of migrant vessels in the Mediterranean Sea. Terrorist attacks, they make security, cultural, and administrative framing much more likely, and these effects, I'm only selecting effects that were very substantively large. So terrorist attacks are clearly linked with framing, especially the three types: security, culture, and administrative framing. Framing of immigrants and refugees is also associated with EU-wide data on asylum applications and illegal border crossings in EU28. Both of those types of data their increases are linked with more frequent use of security, cultural, and administrative framing. So very similar effect like with terrorist attacks. More asylum applications across the EU are associated with more frequent use of humanitarian framing, and more illegal border crossings are associated with less humanitarian framing. So, illegal border crossings perhaps are linked to framing of immigrants as not necessarily, deserving humanitarian compassion and help. So there are very clear effects in this sense. And again, national level statistics, immigration statistics from Slovakia and Czechia seem not to be linked to framing in Czech Republic and Slovakia at all. So while EU-wide statistics are linked to that, national level statistics seem not to be associated. And the same is the case for political events. So elections or European Council summits and other institutionalized political events that I covered are not really associated with framing, or there is no association between the presence of different frames and the occurrences of European Council summits, for instance. Now, clearly, framing also changed very much during the crisis. So the crisis is linked with a significant increase of security, cultural, and administrative framing, and that effect was substantively very large. Now, the opposite is the case for humanitarian and economic framing. So during the crisis, even though there's been a huge debate about humanitarian aspects of immigration during 2015 and 2016, the crisis itself was connected or associated with significantly less fragmented humanitarian as well as economic framing. Overall, when you look at framing, it's basically I'll just show you the graph again, but it's basically negative in both arenas, negative overall. Basically, all the frames except for the humanitarian, which is quite logical because it's positive, by default. But all the frames are basically used in negative terms. So immigrants and refugees are understood as a threat, security, cultural, economic, or governance challenge, rather than a contribution, for instance, cultural or economic contribution to the society. Generally speaking, the cultural and security frames are used most negatively. And, the framing is slightly more negative in, I can show you, is slightly more negative in the political arena than in the media arena. So politicians usually frame immigrants and refugees more negatively than, news reporting. Also, if you look at my regression results, which you can't right now, obviously, but I can tell you, you will see that framing was getting more negative over time, especially as the crisis elapsed. Framing was getting more negative in 2015, 2016, and 2017 compared to 2013 and 2014. So there's been basically a more negative, attitudes, tonality towards the framing of refugees. Now, and finally, the last issue, the categorization of immigrants. And perhaps these are the most interesting results from my perspective, because it seems that there is a very huge explanatory power in terms of categorization of immigrants. In other words, it's really important to account for the categorization of immigrants in plenary speeches or in news media items to see, what kind of, because then you can more easily see what kind of frames will be used. And these effects basically apply to both media and political arena. What I will present relates to the media arena, not the political one, but the results were very similar across the two arenas. You can basically here see the regression table, but I will try to walk you through that. So starting with the security frame, you can clearly see that the odds of security frame appearing in the news items, well, they basically increase by 100% when the MENA region is mentioned as an origin for immigrants and refugees. Now, when you mention Islam as a religious background, well, it's almost 200%. Well, it's 150%, the increase in odds of security framing. At the same time, when you mention irregular immigrants, the odds increased by almost 450%. So if there is an explicit mention of irregular immigrant in a news item, the odds of security frame increase by almost 500%, which is a very, very, very substantively large effect. Now, again, moving to the economic frame, you see economic frame is more common for immigrants and refugees coming from Europe and Southeast Asia, as you can see based on the odds ratios. Interestingly, especially for people coming from Southeast Asia, it's more than 200% increase in the odds of economic framing. On the other hand, obviously, if somebody is referred to as a labor migrant, the odds are also much more likely that economic framing will appear there in those news items. Now, regarding humanitarian framing, which I see it's very interesting, is that people coming from Europe, immigrants and refugees coming from non-EU Eastern Europe, are more likely to be framed in humanitarian terms. Those who have other religion than Islam are also more likely to be framed in humanitarian terms, and also those referred to as asylum seekers are also more likely to be framed in humanitarian terms. But this is not really that surprising. Now, for the cultural frame, what you can see again is that especially if you mention Islam as a religious background, cultural framing then becomes, much more likely. Basically, its odds increase by, by a whopping 1000%. The same applies for people coming from the MENA region, and also for those having a Christian or other religious background. So I guess I don't really have to go through the administrative frame, but you can see that the administrative frame is much more likely for those denoted as asylum seekers and illegal or irregular immigrants. But this is something very understandable. And just to conclude, very briefly, because so far I discussed only the presence of or absence of individual frames based on categorization of immigrants and refugees, but there is also a relation between categorization of immigrants and refugees and the positive or negative use of this framing, even though the effect is not the effects are not or the associations are not that wide. But clearly you can see that the security frame, what I found, the odds of positive framing in terms of security frame, they decrease very much by if a specific news item mentions irregular or illegal immigrants. On the other hand, the odds of positive economic framing, they increase when region of non-Eastern Europe is mentioned as the region of origin for immigrants and refugees. Most interestingly, for humanitarian and cultural frames, you can clearly see that the odds of positive humanitarian framing very much increase for immigrants and refugees whose religion is not Islam, and vice versa. The odds of positive cultural framing very much decrease for immigrants and refugees whose religious background is explicitly being mentioned as Muslim religious background. Humanitarian framing, positive humanitarian framing, is also much more likely for asylum seekers, but that's something one would expect by common sense. And finally, positive cultural framing is positively linked with people coming from non-EU Eastern Europe and negatively linked with people having Islam as their religious denomination or Muslim religious background. So clearly, the categorization of immigrants and refugees overall has a high explanatory power in terms of explaining both the mere presence or absence of individual frames, but also their positive or negative valence or tonality tonality used. And I guess I can, end here because I guess, pretty much the time is up. In my conclusions, what do I really have in my conclusions is we perhaps need more research on Central and Eastern Europe, first of all. It also seems from my research that the low experience with migration, especially from faraway regions, seem to make security and cultural othering a key framing strategies in the region, or at least in Czech Republic and Slovakia. And it also seems that generally the debates surrounding immigrants and refugees are more negative in the region than in the West. Without saying that it's positive in the West, but it seems to be more negative. And my final conclusion is really, research on the framing or portrayal or representation of immigrants and refugees should really take into account their categorization, whatever kind of categorization it is. Now, when I finished my book, I realized I was supposed to look at gender as well, because it could really play a role, but I didn't code these for gender. But I would imagine that, certain types of frames would be much more likely when women or children were explicitly mentioned, as opposed to men, for instance. So that's by means of my conclusions, and apologies for taking longer than expected. But thanks for your attention, really. I'll be happy for any, question, comments, feedback, anything that you may have. Thank you.